Brazil versus Morocco. On most maps, this looks like a mismatch of continents. One country faces the South Atlantic from the Americas. The other sits on Africa's northwest shoulder, facing the Atlantic just below the Strait of Gibraltar. Different languages, different religions, different histories. But now rotate the map so the Atlantic Ocean sits in the centre, with the Americas on one side and Europe and Africa on the other. Suddenly, the distance between Recife and Dakar is shorter than the distance between New York and Los Angeles. About 3,500 kilometres of open water. That is narrower than most people imagine, more like a tight passage than a broad open space. Suddenly the ports of Salvador and the ports of Casablanca sit on the same corridor, a corridor that carried ships, empires, enslaved people, faith, music. And ideas for 5 centuries shaping the streets, buildings and daily life around them. Most world maps push the Atlantic to the margins. They centre on continents, and that centering makes Brazil and Morocco look like they belong to completely different stories. But an Atlantic-centred projection changes everything. The ocean stops looking like a wall, it starts looking like a road. Brazil has over 7,000 kilometres of Atlantic coastline. Morocco has roughly 3,500 kilometres facing the same ocean. Both countries were built facing outward, toward the water, not away from it. Brazil and Morocco are not twins, they are not even close cousins, but they are both Atlantic countries in a way most people never think about. One speaks Portuguese, the other speaks Arabic, Amazigh and French. One is the largest country in South America. The other is a kingdom on Africa's northwest edge, facing both the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean. One is known for carnival and football, from Rio's packed streets to giant stadiums, the other for medinas and mosques, where old city lanes open onto busy courtyards. And yet, both were shaped by the same ocean, not because the water made them similar, but because the water delivered different pressures to each coastline and left different marks. This is not a football preview, and it is not a country comparison. It is a look at the atmosphere on the ground and what that contrast feels like in real places. This is a geographic story about what happens when you stop treating the Atlantic as empty space. Over the next chapters, we will follow that ocean into ports, empires, African identity, sacred rhythm, music, modern cities, and the flags that fill screens, stadiums, and packed city streets whenever these two countries meet. But every chapter begins here, with this map, and by the end, this map will look very different. For now, the Atlantic sits between Brazil and Morocco, and the question is simple: is it separating them or explaining them? But a corridor only matters if something moved through it. Look at any classroom map and the Atlantic Ocean is the simplest thing on it. A blank blue rectangle between two continents. No roads, no cities, no arrows. It's just water, stretching across the frame from edge to edge, with almost nothing else in sight. But the Atlantic was never empty. It has a circulatory system, and that system decided which ports would matter and which coastlines would be connected for centuries. Off the coast of northwest Africa, the Canary Current pulls water southward. It feeds into the North Equatorial Current, which sweeps west toward the Caribbean. Further south, the South Equatorial Current does something similar. It pushes water from the Gulf of Guinea directly toward the Brazilian coast. And then the return loop, the Brazil Current, runs south along South America before bending east, carried by westerly winds back towards southern Africa and Europe. These are not random drifts. They return with the seasons, follow consistent paths, and shape the waters with powerful force. For any vessel relying on wind and current, they turn the Atlantic into a set of one-way lanes. The northeast shoulder of Brazil, cities like Recife and Salvador, sits closer to West Africa than to southern Brazil. In the age of sail, reaching Salvador from the West African coast could take as little as 35 days with favourable winds. Reaching Salvador overland from São Paulo meant a journey of months, crossing vast stretches of Brazil by slow, difficult routes. The ocean was not a barrier, it was faster than the land behind it. For 3 centuries, more people crossed this ocean involuntarily than voluntarily. Historians estimate that over 12 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Brazil alone received roughly 5 million, more than any other country in the Americas. They arrived overwhelmingly through ports: Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, Recife. But people were not the only cargo. Sugar moved east, textiles moved south, guns moved west. Gold, ivory, spices, and religious ideas circulated in every direction. By the 18th century, the Atlantic was the most heavily trafficked ocean corridor on Earth, busier than the Mediterranean, busier than the Indian Ocean routes that had. For 1,000 years, monsoon trade routes across the Indian Ocean connected Asia and East Africa, linking busy ports and exchanging goods, people, and ideas. And yet our maps still show it as empty space. That blue rectangle hides one of the densest webs of human movement in history. Every current carried something, and every wind pattern favoured a port somewhere along the route. And the ports that sat at the right points on those loops became the places where the Atlantic's logic turned into language, labour, food, music, and faith. The ocean was the engine, but the ports were where the engine became visible. Routes need endpoints, and the endpoints that mattered most were not capitals, they were ports. Empire does not start at the throne, it starts at the dock where the ships arrive. Portugal controlled Brazil for over 3 centuries. From 1500 to 1822, the colony existed to extract sugar, gold, diamonds, and above all labour. An estimated 4 million enslaved Africans were forcibly transported to Brazil across the Atlantic. That is roughly 10 times the number brought to all of North America. And the vast majority arrived through just a handful of crowded port cities, where ships, docks, and immigration checkpoints funneled newcomers ashore. Salvador was the first, and for over 200 years the most important. Founded in 1549 as the colonial capital, it sat on the Bay of All Saints, one of the largest natural harbours in the world. Ships from Lisbon, the West African coast, and the sugar plantations of the interior all converged here. Salvador was not just a city. It was the central node of Portugal's Atlantic extraction machine, the port where wealth from across the ocean was funneled inland. Across the ocean. Morocco faced the same Atlantic, but from a fundamentally different position. The Portuguese arrived on the Moroccan coast in the 1400s, earlier than they reached Brazil. They seized coastal forts at Ceuta, Tangier, Essaouira, El Jadida, and Safi, but they could not hold the interior. Morocco's ruling dynasties pushed back, recaptured most of those positions, and maintained what almost no other African or South American territory managed: continuous sovereignty. That does not mean Morocco was untouched. Spain still holds Ceuta and Melilla today, two small enclaves on Morocco's northern coast. France imposed a protectorate from 1912 to 1956 that reshaped Casablanca, Rabat, and the entire administrative structure. But the Moroccan monarchy survived. The kingdom was pressured, not erased. This is the critical difference. Brazil was created by colonization. Its language, its borders, its population, its cities, all products of an imperial project that dismantled what existed before and built something new using African labor and European capital on American land. Morocco absorbed Atlantic imperial pressure but retained its own political spine. Both countries were shaped by the ocean, but one was built by empire. The other endured it too, staying exactly where it was despite the same punishing conditions around it. You can see that difference written into the architecture, in the layout of the streets and the design of the buildings themselves. In Salvador's Pelourinho district, the colonial churches are gilded with gold from the mines of Minas Gerais, decorated by enslaved craftsmen. In Essaouira, the Portuguese-era ramparts face the Atlantic like a scar, rebuilt, repurposed, now part of a Moroccan city that predates and outlasts every foreign occupier. The Atlantic delivered empires to both coastlines, but it did not deliver the same empire or the same outcome. And the places where that logic is most visible are not the palaces or the parliaments, they are the ports. Empire leaves architecture, language and religion behind, but it also leaves ports, and ports have longer memories than palaces. Every country has a capital that tells you what it wants to be, but ports tell you what it actually is. Before Rio de Janeiro, before Brasilia, the capital of Brazil was Salvador. For over 200 years, the country was governed from a city built on a cliff above the Bay of All Saints. The bay was one of the finest natural harbours in the Atlantic world. Ships could anchor safely, load sugar and tobacco, and unload the human cargo at the harbour, the people whose arrival would define the city forever. Salvador received more enslaved Africans than any other port in the Americas. Estimates suggest nearly 5 million people were brought to Brazil across the Atlantic. The port did not just move goods. Along its crowded docks and warehouses, it created a society. The food, the language, the religion, the rhythm of Salvador were shaped by the people who arrived in chains. And they rebuilt their lives right at the waterline, where homes and daily routines began again beside the shore. Now cross the Atlantic. Casablanca is Morocco's largest city, its economic engine and its Atlantic face. Its port handles roughly half of the country's trade. Yet most outsiders imagine Morocco through Marrakesh, a city that faces the desert, not the sea. Casablanca breaks that image. Its waterfront boulevard, its port cranes, its apartment blocks, these are the textures of a working Atlantic city, not a postcard. Tangier sits where the Atlantic meets the Mediterranean, where Africa looks across 14 kilometers of water at Europe. For decades, Tangier operated as an international zone, governed not by Morocco alone, but by a consortium of foreign powers. It was a threshold city, where European streets met the Atlantic waterfront and the edge of a wider world. Farther south, Essaouira faces the open ocean from behind Portuguese-era ramparts built in the 18th century. Sugar, gold, and enslaved people passed through its gates under successive powers. Today Essaouira is quieter, but its cultural memory is loud. The Nawa musicians who perform in its streets carry a tradition rooted in sub-Saharan African heritage. brought north along trade routes long before European ships arrived. 4 ports, 2 countries, each one shaped not by what the nation decided to become, but by who and what the ocean delivered. Ports shape identity through who arrives, who stays, and what they carry. In Brazil and Morocco, what they carried includes something most maps cannot show. Brazil is not usually described as African. Morocco, across the Strait of Gibraltar in North Africa, is not always imagined that way either. Both assumptions miss something important, and this chapter is where the Atlantic connection gets personal. Of the estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans forced across the Atlantic, more than half were brought to Brazil, not the United States. Not the Caribbean as a whole, Brazil alone, stretching across most of South America's eastern coast. That means the African cultural imprint on Brazil is not an accent. It is a foundation. In Salvador, the food carries West African ingredients: palm oil, black-eyed peas, okra. The language absorbed hundreds of words from Yoruba and Bantu. Candomblé, the Afro-Brazilian spiritual tradition rooted in Yoruba and other West African belief systems, survived centuries of suppression in Salvador. Its temples, called terreiros, are among the oldest continuous African-descended sacred spaces in the Americas. Capoeira was developed by enslaved Africans as both resistance and expression. Salvador today has the largest population of African descent of any city outside the African continent. Now, across the Atlantic, Morocco sits on the northwest shoulder of Africa, geographically undeniably African. But ask most outsiders to describe Morocco. And for many people, Africa is still rarely the first word that comes to mind, even when a world map is right in front of them. That framing misses layers. The Amazigh, the indigenous people of North Africa, have lived in what is now Morocco for thousands of years, long before the arrival of Arab culture. And Islam. Amazigh languages are spoken by a significant share of Morocco's population, and Amazigh identity is woven into architecture, agriculture, textiles, and daily life across the Atlas Mountains. But Morocco's African dimension goes further south. For centuries, trans-Saharan trade routes connected Moroccan cities to sub-Saharan West Africa, carrying gold, salt, textiles, and people. The Nawa communities in cities like Essaouira, Marrakesh, and Fez trace their ancestry to sub-Saharan African populations who arrived through these routes. Nawa music, language fragments, and spiritual practice carry that memory forward in living form. So Africa lives inside both countries, but the paths are fundamentally different. In Brazil, the African dimension arrived through the largest forced migration in recorded history. It survived through resistance, adaptation, and cultural persistence in port cities like Salvador. In Morocco, the African dimension is not imported, it is indigenous. The Amazigh are African, the Saharan connections are African, the Nawa memory is African. These are not parallel stories unfolding side by side, they intersect in the same place, often in ways you can see on the ground. They are two fundamentally different ways that Africa can live inside a national identity, shaped by the same ocean, but through entirely different mechanisms. And yet the global image of both countries tends to flatten these layers. Brazil becomes carnival, football and beaches. Morocco becomes desert, Medinas and spice markets. Neither image is false, but both hide the deeper identity that the Atlantic helped create. Identity does not stay inside archives. It moves into the streets, through bells, drums, prayer calls, processions and rhythm. What does geography sound like when it moves through faith and music, from mountain villages to echoing sanctuaries? What if the oldest map between Brazil and Morocco is not drawn in ink, but played on drums and strings? In Salvador, 3 drums called atabaques sit at the centre of candomblé ceremonies. They are not background music, they are invocations, tuned to specific rhythms that call specific orishas, spiritual beings carried across the Atlantic from Yoruba and Fon traditions in West Africa. The atabaque arrived in Brazil inside the memory of enslaved people. No instrument survived the Middle Passage, but the rhythmic knowledge did. And in Salvador, that knowledge was rebuilt, in wood, in goatskin, in patterns passed from hand to hand across generations. Capoeira tells a parallel story. It looks like dance, it sounds like music, but it was developed as self-defense disguised inside rhythm and movement. A practice so threatening to colonial authorities that it was criminalized in Brazil until 1937. Today, samba, capoeira and candomblé drumming are recognized pillars of Brazilian culture, but their function goes deeper than performance. They are living archives of forced migration, spiritual survival and resistance, stored in rhythm because written records were denied. And across the Atlantic, not westward but southward, skimming the vast hand sweep of the Sahara below. In Morocco, a tradition called Nawa carries a different African memory through a different instrument. The yembri, a 3-stringed bass lute with a camel skin resonator. The word Nawa itself likely derives from a term for sub-Saharan African communities who arrived in Morocco through centuries of trans-Saharan exchange and forced labour. Nawa is not Moroccan folk music in the way outsiders sometimes imagine it. It is a healing tradition. Its ceremonies use specific musical modes paired with specific colours, incense and movement to address spiritual and psychological states. Every June, the port city of Essaouira hosts the Nawa and World Music Festival, launched in 1998, now drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors. But Nawa did not need a festival to survive. It survived because its ritual function was irreplaceable inside the communities that carried it. Here is what matters for the Atlantic story. Candomblé drumming and Nawa trance rituals are not the same tradition. They do not share instruments, languages, melodies, or direct historical contact. One remembers the forced transatlantic crossing, the other remembers trans-Saharan movement into North Africa. But both traditions use music as a technology of memory, storing migration, spirituality, healing and belonging in rhythm rather than in text. Both survived because they served functions that colonial and post-colonial societies could not erase. And both ended up on Atlantic coastlines, Salvador facing east across the water, Essaouira facing west. The connection is not sameness. It is that the Atlantic and the Sahara both produced coastlines where music became the archive that written history could not be. Music carries memory, but it does not stay in the past. It moves into modern cities, and that is where both countries surprise you most. The world imagines Brazil through beaches and carnival. It imagines Morocco through Medinas and desert. Both images hide the ordinary Atlantic cities where most people actually live. Ask someone to picture Rio de Janeiro, and they will see Copacabana, Sugarloaf Mountain, and Christ the Redeemer above the bay. But Rio has more than 14 million people in its metro area. Most of them live in working neighbourhoods far from the tourist waterfront. The postcard version accounts for only about 3% of the city's geography, a small slice of the whole place most visitors actually see. Now ask someone to picture Morocco, and they will almost certainly describe Marrakesh, the Medina, the desert light, the souks. But Marrakesh is not even Morocco's largest city. That distinction belongs to Casablanca, a dense, modern Atlantic metropolis of nearly 4 million people. It drives roughly half of Morocco's industrial output, a city of office towers, container ports, highway overpasses and apartment districts. São Paulo is the largest city in the southern hemisphere, over 22 million people in its metropolitan area. Larger than Cairo, larger than Lagos, larger than any city in Europe. It sits 60 kilometers inland from the coast, but its economic engine was built through Santos, the Atlantic port that funnels Brazilian exports to the world. Coffee, sugar, soybeans and manufactured goods all pass through Santos on their way across the same ocean we have been tracing. The port made the city. The Atlantic made the port. Casablanca works the same way. Its port is the largest in Morocco, handling the majority of the country's trade. Phosphate rock, Morocco controls roughly 70% of the world's reserves, leaves from Atlantic ports and reaches Brazil, among other destinations. The trade follows the water. And then there is Rabat. Morocco's capital sits directly on the Atlantic, where the Beau Regreg River meets the ocean. Marrakesh receives over 3 million tourists a year. Rabat receives a fraction of that. The capital of the country faces the Atlantic, and most visitors never see it. Tangier faces two bodies of water at once, the Atlantic on one side, the Mediterranean on the other. Europe is visible across the Strait of Gibraltar, just 14 kilometers away, with the Spanish coast clear on the horizon. Tangier is a port city, a transit city, shaped by the movement of people between continents. It has more in common with Santos or Salvador than with the interior desert most outsiders imagine. In Casablanca, the Hassan's II mosque stands on a platform built directly over the Atlantic Ocean. Completed in 1993, it was designed so that worshippers could pray above the sea. It is one of the largest mosques in the world, and its placement is not accidental. It faces the ocean, not the desert. It declares that Morocco's identity extends outward from the Atlantic coast, looking beyond the shoreline itself. Most outsiders never register that detail. They file Morocco under desert, Islam and the interior, but the country's economic heart, its political capital, and its most ambitious architectural statement all sit on the Atlantic facing the open ocean. The same ocean that shaped Brazil's port cities, the same corridor that carried ships, goods and ideas for centuries. These are not postcard countries. These are modern Atlantic urban societies, messy, dense, working, ordinary and far more complex than any tourist image allows. Modern cities are where national images get made, and both countries know the world is watching. Millions recognise the flags of Brazil and Morocco instantly. Almost no one thinks about the ocean between them. Ask anyone to describe Brazil in 3 words and you will hear beaches, carnival, football. Ask about Morocco and you will hear desert, Medinas, Islam. Both answers are real. Neither is wrong. But both leave out the Atlantic, the single geographic fact that shaped each country more than any postcard ever could. Global media compresses nations into thumbnails. Brazil becomes a highlight reel of goals and samba. Morocco becomes a backdrop of sand dunes and spice markets. The compression is not malicious, it is just efficient, and efficiency erases coastlines, ports, and 5 centuries of oceanic history. In 2022, Morocco's national football team reached the World Cup semi-finals, the first African and Arab nation to do so. For a few weeks, the world paid attention. Commentators scrambled to explain a country most of their audiences had never thought about beyond tourism. But here is the pattern. A football tournament creates a global spotlight. The spotlight burns bright for 30 days. Then it moves on. Brazil knows this cycle intimately. 5 World Cup titles have made the yellow shirt one of the most recognised symbols on earth. But that recognition rarely leads anyone to ask about Salvador's port memory, São Paulo's Atlantic economic engine, or why more than half of Brazil's population identifies as black. Or mixed race, a visible reminder of how communities and identities overlap in the same place. Recognition is not the same as understanding. A place can look familiar at first glance and still remain unread. Now look at what happens outside the stadium, where the atmosphere shifts and the surrounding streets begin to fill with movement. Morocco is the world's largest exporter of phosphates, a mineral Brazil's agricultural sector depends on to keep its farmland productive. Brazilian soybeans and Moroccan fertilizer already travel the same Atlantic corridor that carried ships and empires centuries ago. Bilateral trade between the two countries has been growing steadily, with more goods moving across their shared routes each year. Diplomatic coordination is expanding, especially as Morocco strengthens ties across Africa and Brazil deepens its engagement with the African Union. These are not cultural exchanges designed for cameras, they are economic systems following Atlantic geography. The fertilizer that feeds Brazilian soil comes from Moroccan mines. The grain that feeds global markets grows in Brazilian fields. The Atlantic carries both, just as it always has, moving people, goods and ideas between these shores. And yet none of this appears on the matchday graphic. The flags face each other across a pitch, not across an ocean. The commentators name the players, not the ports. The broadcast ends, the connection stays. The match will end, the flags will fold, but the Atlantic will still be there. The match will have a final whistle, the ocean will not. Every route traced in this episode, ships, empires, enslaved people, faith, music, migration, trade, football, still runs through the same water. This is the map we started with, but now every line means something. Salvador to Casablanca, Essaouira to Rio, Tangier to São Paulo. Port to port, coast to coast, memory to memory carried across harbours, shorelines and generations. The Atlantic did not ask permission before it shaped these countries. It carried Portuguese ships to Brazil and French pressure to Morocco. It moved millions of enslaved Africans west and layered centuries of Saharan exchange north. It deposited candomblé drums in Salvador and Nawa rhythms in Essaouira. It built cities at the waterline that still carry the evidence today. Brazil and Morocco are not twins, they were never meant to be, but they are both Atlantic countries, shaped by the same ocean through very different pressures. The Atlantic is not getting less important. Climate negotiations, migration routes, energy corridors and trade all run through this water. The ocean is becoming more central to both futures, not less, from crowded ports to contested shipping lanes. Brazil and Morocco will keep appearing on the same screen, through football fixtures, trade summits, and the quiet movement of goods, people, and ideas across the Atlantic. The connection is not about sameness, but about recognizing something familiar across different places and people. It is about the fact that the same ocean shaped two very different countries in ways that become visible only when you stop treating the water as empty. An open sense of space stretches in every direction, with the horizon feeling wide and uninterrupted. The next time you see the flags of Brazil and Morocco side by side, remember, the most important thing between them is not distance. It is water, and water has a longer memory than any scoreboard.